a creeping decay.
This is the story of a small group of commercial fishermen, oyster farmers and government employees who, 30 years ago, sought action on one of Australia's most serious coastal water quality issues from acid sulfate soils. Every story has a beginning. This story has several. Thousands of years ago, the sea rose to a level about 1 metre or more than it is today. The sea flooded the quiet coastal valleys, and over time, mangroves colonised the intertidal zone, creating huge wetlands. Fallen mangrove leaves were broken down by bacteria, leaving sulphur compounds buried in the mud. These lay undisturbed as the sea level dropped to its present height, and the wetlands were converted from saltwater vegetation to freshwater. These wetlands provided important habitats for wildlife, fish and prawns. Each year, part of the wetlands dried out, then were replenished by floodwaters. This cycle was very productive.
Beast.
The second beginning involved European farmers who settled the coastal valleys over 100 years ago to grow cattle and crops like sugarcane.
Dad was a farmer, and we used to have some of the best drought country on the North Coast on our river when the swamps went dry. Very nutritious, that swamp grass. Well, I left school when I was 14, nearly 15. I worked at the fish co-op for 1 year and then went commercial fishing. So I've been fishing virtually all my life. And as a young fisherman in my 20s, I was actually going into the grass paddock area, Golden Hole area to go mashing. And it was the time they were blocking it off.
The settlement of the floodplains brought with it enormous change, including the construction of large-scale flood control structures, which prevented the rivers from regularly rejuvenating the wetlands. In addition, hundreds of kilometres of drains, large and small, were dug to try and make the land support cattle and sugarcane. Barrages and floodgates ensured that as the land dried out, acid sulfate soils were exposed to the air. These projects commonly affected thousands of hectares of wetlands and affected more than just one flood basin. These floodgates also ensured that fish and prawns, especially juveniles, were unable to reach the previously protected nursery habitats.
My late father said there's been 100 kilometres of tidal waterways taken off this river. Now you can prawn, but a lot of fish come out of here over the years. A lot of fish. Before that thing went up there.
History of the Lansdowne was pretty grim after 1967, was when they drained the North Moto, sort of 1,000-acre swamp wetland at the time.
The exposed acid scalded the land, making it hard for plants to grow. Metals like iron and aluminium from the clays dissolved in the fresh water, only to be deposited downstream. As the seawater rapidly reduced the acidity, the iron staining created a rust-like coating on plants and the mud, whereas the aluminium created unusual blue or green colours and a milkiness in the water. The third beginning saw a rise in activism by those who depended on the waterways for their livelihoods. The scale of the problem was truly shocking and resulted in a national strategy, but funds and commitment to rehabilitation were never adequate.
Well, we basically had thousands and thousands of tonnes of dead fish floating down there on an annual basis. The amount of dead fish, and that red spot in particular, was a horrifying thing. Well, basically it was a problem that everybody knew about. They didn't know what was causing it. They didn't want to address it, and the sugarcane industry in particular ruled the roost on all earth matters.
Thought I should measure the pH as well as another normal parameter to record. And when I measured that, it was about 3 or 3.1. It was incredibly low, and I was just totally shocked at this, and to the extent that I thought the meter was broken.
And back then, we were probably only 6 or 7 years into oyster farming, and we were starting single seed production, so we're starting to see the backs of little oysters being eaten out and things like that. So at the same time, I think we became aware of the acid sulfate soil issues and the water quality issues arising.
Red spot was becoming quite prevalent, and no one really knew what was causing it. And so the vets started to examine fish when they were brought in, and they sort of made the connection between acid water and fungal infections.
They put a floodgate structure on, quite often on public creeks, certainly on a lot of drains, and that builds the acid up behind the floodgate, and then it only releases at low tide.
We all thought we were bulletproof, which at that stage we were. We told it exactly as it was. We didn't underdo the thing. We weren't fighting the threats from politicians or farmers or local government.
We've noticed a distinct lack of productivity in the restraint system. Prawns, very noticeable. Crab, very noticeable. Fish, because of migration, a little bit more difficult, taking very good. But definitely overall, a lack of production, a lack of productivity. Some species, particularly recreational species, are going.
Yes, it's hard to get agreement on letting water in on the country that's been drained, even though it's not very useful land, most of it. Yes, I can still feel some of the public scorn, public criticism, public attack, some challenges to my employment thrown in as well. Interesting times. Not much is happening.
Well, I had death threats at one stage or another where a couple of farmers lobbed along here one night, half drunk, and threatened to tar and feather me and then run me out of town or kill me, whatever they felt like at the time. But slowly a small group of fishermen mainly, and I was oyster farmer, realised that this problem had to be solved if we were going to stay catching fish in these estuaries.
Well, I very quickly became recognised within this industry at a state level as, the activist for, water quality and acid sulfate soils. And of course that put me into the firing line, particularly locally here with local government and council, and of course, we're in a rural area with a lot of agricultural operators, and the dairy industry back then was very powerful and very vocal. We did have quite a bit of success for probably the first 10 or 15 years after 94, I think, where it was really a hot agenda here with local government for a long time.
Yeah, I did. I put my hand up for every committee that was available to try and rehabilitate the drains and the things, but you didn't get anywhere. Like, the landholders outvoted you, and the grants that they got just seemed to continue to make the drains deeper and wider and longer, and the main problem they came up with engineering solutions to the wrong engineering thing in the first place. Instead of filling in a drain and seeing what happened, they dug it deeper, put a bigger floodgate on the end.
To put it bluntly, I think we opened a floodgate of our own in terms of interest, science, chemistry, the ecological impacts that we now know are totally devastating. It's good to see tidal water coming in, but it has to go back out. There's a fishery out there that's going to be impacted by the North Coast, or particularly the North Coast of New South Wales is the worst, one of the worst in the world.
There have been a number of attempts over the past 30 years to rehabilitate the damaged floodplain wetlands with varying degrees of success. However, this fish kill near the Belmore floodgates on the Macleay River was filmed in 2022 and is very similar to the same problem that was occurring in the Clybucket area just across the river almost 30 years ago. This is the Big Swamp area, which drains into the Manning River via Cat Eye Creek, filmed in 1995 and again in 2023. Extensive acid scolds remain, but there has been some success rehabilitating the Cat Eye wetlands, seen on the left-hand side of this image, and this may have improved the quality of water entering the creek. The most successful rehabilitation project is the Yarrahappini Broadwater on the lower Macleay River. Here the tidal barrage has slowly washed away, allowing tidal waters to fully access the wetlands. More importantly, the acid soils are kept underwater, thus stopping the production of acid and allowing fish, crabs and prawns to prosper once again. But some areas have seen no progress at all. This is the Tuckian Broadwater on the Richmond River, which receives acid water from the overdrained Tuckian Swamp, upstream of the tidal barrage at Baggetville.
But nothing's changed on the Richmond. I've been up there in recent times looking at, trying to find wild colonies of oysters down the bottom end of the Richmond. But it's a real disaster and pretty much a national disgrace. I mean, the last commercial crop of oysters farmed in the Richmond River was 1974.
Despite the lower reaches being managed by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, there are many acid scalds, and the Broadwater is regularly subject to acid discharges, characterised by the blue or green plumes of aluminium compounds and the low pH values for weeks, if not months.
Well, the landholders were all against it, but they were against just about everything that reinstated the floodplain. They obviously didn't want to make money because you just can't. Catchment management committees which drove issues such as this don't exist anymore. The government has taken over this role themselves, and naturally enough they'll only do what they want to do.
It's really unfortunately lost its momentum in recent years, and there doesn't seem to be the same interest in restoring these areas, and clearly they are vital to the early life cycles of a lot of fish species.
Well, I think Yarrahappini, we just wore them down over time. Yeah, I think keep the water table in a swamp as high as you can. And everyone up there used to think to keep it as low as you possibly could. But the main thing here is the filling in of the drains that drain the back swamps. And until they're done, I don't think there'll be proper rehabilitation of anything as far as the waterways go.
They've got to get more active, more voice. They're starting to realise now that the river's not producing like it used to.
Oh, I think we need to somehow engage them back into, for us with oyster farming, it's very critical and starts just with water quality and, look at your point source pollution events on your catchment, and in this case with your overdrained floodplains and your drains, then, get involved and start to get reconnected back with the people that matter in planning departments, your local members and all those things that we did, and raise the profile right through to the top.
And I can remember I naively went to Sydney and saw the fishing industry organisation and said, give me 5,000, I'll tidy this thing up and cure it within 6 months. That 6 months ended up the rest of my life, and I was around about 40 something at the time, and I'm now 84.
Will healing begin?